This sanctuary was built in the 1980s. About 10 years after this sanctuary was built, I was serving a church in Southern California, and we built a family life center. And I know for both buildings, foundations were very important. I've seen some beautiful pictures of the building of this church, this sanctuary. Who was here when this was built? Raise some hands, see some hands. And yeah, I've seen pictures. Chuck, I've seen pictures of you in here, the building, doing stuff, and fantastic. I was not here, so I would trust that the city had lots of inspectors on site to make sure the foundations were just perfect. And knowing Las Vegas the way I know Las Vegas, I'm sure they were all over the place inspecting this. However, about 10 years after this was built, we built the Family Life Center down at a church in Southern California where I was serving, and I knew everything was perfect because I worked with the architect from the beginning. I knew everything was going to be just right, and when we began, we knew there weren't going to be any issues at all. But then we had a few surprises. There's always surprises. We built the Family Life Center on a sloping hill. It didn't seem to have much slope, but it was a sloping hill. In Southern California, everything seems like it's built on terraces. And so it was sloping, and the architect wanted to save us a few dollars, and so the back end of the building was even with the parking lot rather than dropping it in with a retaining wall at the back end. So we did that. He didn't quite anticipate the slope was as much as it was, and so we had these huge sloping sidewalks going up into the building to get into the building, but we could deal with that. What we really did not anticipate was where we put the Family Life Center, there were two very large shamel ash trees right in the center of that location. And they were gigantic. They were 30 years old, and we cut them down, we excavated, and they kept excavating and excavating. The roots were unbelievable. So we built this Family Life Center in a location where we didn't quite anticipate the slope, which meant some things about the foundation you had to do. And then we had these shamel ash caverns underneath the building itself. And we poured so much concrete into there to make up for a few of those mistakes. It was unbelievable. And I used to tell people living in California, you're always worried about the big earthquake. And I told folks, if there's ever a big earthquake, you want to be right here. There is so much concrete, and the foundations are solid. So our new series is Foundations. And yes, we need foundations to build buildings. And yes, people need foundations to build lives. We need foundations to weather the tests and the trials and the temptations that come our way. And so Jesus tells a parable. Actually, before he tells the parable, which is the lesson from Matthew today, about building on rock as opposed to shifting sand, before he tells the parable, there's a long sermon in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, which is known as the Sermon on the Mount. And at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells a parable to remind people, you've got to build with these things as a part of your foundation. Wise people build on rock, and the rock is the Word of God. And foolish people build on sand, and I felt like we were kind of foolish in Southern California with the concrete we poured, but I guess the parable would say we were wise because the foundation was good at the end of the day there. And so Jesus tells a parable. Here's a little picture of it. The graphic here, you've got to build on rock. And when the rain comes, it won't wash away. But if you build on sand and the foundation's no good, it will wash away. There's even a kid's song. We are teaching the kids the song this morning. They're coming in next week for the kids' message. They're going to sing this song, since we're going to go back to this every week in our series about building on good foundations. Remember this song, Wise Man Built His House Upon the Rock? Anybody learn that in Sunday school, or you taught Sunday school and you taught the kids? A great little song, and the kids love this song. A wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. And then it goes on, the wise man built his house upon the rock. The rains came down, the floods came up, but the house on the rock stood firm. As opposed to the foolish man, the song goes, built his house upon the sand. The rains came tumbling down, the rains came down, the floods came up. It repeats, the kids will have hand motions next week, and the house on the sand went swoosh. When you build on bad foundations, you got nothing at the end of the day. And so this series about foundations. How you build your life on the rock. What types of things you use to build your life. And Martin Luther is going to help us here. That's why you have the small catechism. Martin Luther is going to help us here because he wrote some teaching materials over 400 years ago that continue to be excellent and to help us focus on foundations. Martin Luther would say that everything you need to know about being a Christian is in the handout you have in your hand today. Or you don't have it yet and you'll pick it up on your way out the door. The small catechism. What's in the small catechism? The 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the meaning of Holy Baptism and Holy Communion. Those are the things that help you build upon the rock. It's the small catechism. He also wrote, Martin Luther wrote a large catechism. There's two differences. The large is much larger, of course. But the small is written for all of us. The small catechism was written for moms and dads in the churches, for grandmas and grandpas, and it was given to us to teach kids at home foundations. Now, what we've done in the Lutheran Church is we've taken the small catechism and we say, well, that's confirmation. We use that for teaching confirmation, and that's good. However, we all are supposed to know this stuff. It's foundational, and we're supposed to teach our kids. And we're supposed to, in our families, know about this stuff. The 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, the meaning of Holy Baptism, and Holy Communion. So we begin today with the beginning of the small catechism, which is the 10 Commandments. You've got 10 commandments in the Old Testament. Actually, there are more than 10. Do you know how many rules, laws, and commandments total in the Old Testament? 613 rules, laws, and commandments. We know that because the rabbis went through and counted them. They like to keep track of this stuff. And the problem with all those rules is not that there are rules, because we'll get to that in a minute. Rules are not necessarily bad for you. They're good for you. You need rules in life. But the problem is that some people thought the way to get to heaven was you had to keep all the rules. And that is just daunting, to try to keep 613 rules, laws, and commandments, or to try to keep 10 rules to get into heaven. That is tough to do, In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul thought you got to heaven by keeping all 613 rules, laws, and commandments. He was a Pharisee. A Pharisee is an Aramaic word. It means the separated one. Pharisees were separated from normal life. You couldn't live normal life if you're trying to remember 613 rules, laws, and commandments. And then Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he learned you don't get into heaven through rules, you get into heaven through the person of Jesus. And then Paul goes on to write something really remarkable later in the New Testament. He tells people, you cannot get into heaven by keeping the rules. He says, if you could do it, I would have got to heaven that way because I've got an OCD complex on rules. He said, seriously, he said, I could keep all the rules. If anybody could, I could, but I couldn't do it. It's through Jesus. And then he said, however, rules are good for you. The law is good for you because it gives structure to life. And it helps us in our decision making as to what we need to move forward with in our life. You've got rules in your family, right? Kids growing up, grandkids, you tell them, don't play where? In the street, of course, because it's good for them. Don't play in the street. It's good for you. It's like my mom used to tell me as a kid, eat your lima beans. Dumb rule, but it was a good rule because it's good for you. You have to eat that stuff. And I grew up, I really don't eat lima beans today. However, I eat spinach and kale. So I guess Mom did some good with that rule. 10 Commandments. And they're good for you. However, they don't get you to heaven. But they're good for you because they help all of us negotiate in life what's important. Let me share an illustration here. about how you really need sometimes rules, or to understand the rules, to negotiate life. I went to college at Grand Canyon University down in Phoenix. And my job, working my way through college, I was the manager and the trainer for the basketball team. When I was a sophomore, we won the national championship. We were in Kansas City. We traveled all over the nation, and we won the national championship. So the following year, we were invited to do exhibition games in various places. One of the places we went was Buenos Aires, Argentina. And the team played the Argentinian semi-pro teams down there. Stayed in Buenos Aires. I still remember. I was roommate with one of the players, my good friend Jeff, and we were wandering the streets of Buenos Aires one night, and we were each about 20 years old. We wandered across the street from where we were staying, and it was a beautiful plaza, park area, and we thought, well, that's a good place to go walk and see what's out here in the city. And in the middle of this plaza park area, there was a pole. A metal pole, and it had wrapped around it, painted around it, sort of like a barbershop kind of thing, a white stripe. And we thought, well, that's odd, but we walked over there. Apparently, the rule in Buenos Aires was when you see that pole with the white stripe, that means it's a military installation. And so we walked onto a military installation in the middle of Buenos Aires, and we were met with a very angry guard with an M16 pointed at us. He made us walk around the whole installation, this whole big installation, because they didn't know what we were doing and they wanted to check us out. Maybe you've watched these old World War II war movies, and they have prison camps and guards on towers and walls with machine guns. That's all true. We walked around the installation, and as we walked, you could see the guards up on the walls, and these huge machine guns were pivoting and following us as we walked. Oh my gosh, it was horrible. We didn't understand the rules. So rules can be good for you. However, they don't get you to heaven. But it's important to have some rules. What's the first rule? You shall have no other gods. Now, Martin Luther, he's trying to follow a little bit in the legacy of Jesus, who simplifies things for people to understand. So the rabbis in the Old Testament said there are 613 rules, laws, and commandments. Jesus says, nah, it's too many. How many rules does Jesus say people need? Two rules, yes, two. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength. And Jesus combines another rule with it that no rabbi had ever combined with it. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love people. Sound familiar? It's our mission here. If you ask the kids, what's your mission? No other Sunday school that I know of could tell you the mission statement. Most Lutheran churches have mission statements that are rambling and long, and the adults don't know them. But our kids can tell you, love God, love people. And that's what Jesus said. That's how you get to heaven. Love God, love people. So Martin Luther, with that in mind, what Jesus is doing, he starts his small catechism, you shall have no other gods. And Martin Luther, he says that if you want to know all 10 commandments, which commandment do you think you have to know? Number 1. If you know you shall have no other gods, you get the rest of the commandments, because it's all about having only the one true God. And then in another place, Martin Luther says, you want to understand the whole Bible? You want to get what the Old Testament is about? You want to get what the New Testament is about? You just got to know one thing. What do you think? You shall have no other gods. And so we begin the 10 Commandments with you shall have no other gods. It says in the small catechism, we are to fear, love, and trust God above all things. That is really churchy. And, it sounds good, but what does that really mean in our life? Well, in the larger catechism, Martin Luther writes the small catechism for us, just regular folks in the church. He writes the large catechism for pastors who didn't have good theological training back then. He says in the large catechism, he explains it a little better. He says, what does this mean to have no other gods? He says it means that you look to a God for all the good you need in your life. He writes here, a God is the term for that to which we are to look for all good and in which we are to find a refuge in all need. Therefore, to have a God is nothing else than to trust and believe in that one with your whole heart. So whenever you have a need, Martin Luther would say, and this is more kind of close to the ground and not as churchy as the small catechism explanation. Luther says, whenever you have a need, whenever you are anxious, whenever you have a bad day, whenever you have a bad week, when you have a bad season in your life, whatever it is you think about, whatever it is you turn to get relief, that is your God. You put your trust in that. So, maybe it's your 401k, maybe it's your finances, maybe it's your health, maybe it's your kids, your family. It doesn't matter what it is. Whatever in your life that you turn to when you're stressed out, sort of like you have OCD about that, and you're in a rut and you can't get out of the rut. Martin Luther would say, that is your God. And we should have no other gods except the one true God. He writes, there are some who think that they have God and everything they need when they have money and property, on which they set their whole heart, and other things, of course, too. Thus, you can easily understand what and how much this commandment requires, namely that one's whole heart and confidence be placed in God alone and in no one else. If you want to understand the 10 Commandments, get the first one. If you want to understand the whole Bible, get the first commandment. You shall have no other gods. But he does, in his catechism, he does take time, Martin Luther, to explain all the commandments and what he is doing here. And I want to say again that you need some rules for boundaries in your life. What he's doing here is ethically and morally teaching what it is to be a Christian. Because if you grew up in Lutheran Church Sunday school like me, you learned the 10 Commandments. And I learned everything you shouldn't do. And I appreciate Eric's comment at men's breakfast. He said as a Sunday school kid, and I agreed with him, as a Sunday school kid, he said the only one I could project myself into, imagine myself being a part of, was thou shalt not steal. Because little kids, we like to steal things sometimes. And we're not quite sure whose property it is we're getting. My son Michael, when he was about that age we were talking about, he came home and he had a bunch of kids' stuff from school in his backpack. And he told us, I don't know what happened. I opened it up and it just was there. It fell in. So, we can project ourselves into a couple commandments. But what Martin Luther is doing is not saying this is what you shouldn't do, but this is what you also should do. So don't steal. Don't gossip. Don't take God's name in vain. All that stuff. Don't murder. Don't covet. But he also says at the tail end of those commandments, and he uses the word, if you go through here, there's a little word he uses in explaining all the commandments, but. You've heard it said this, don't do it. You're going to get your hand slapped. We all know that. But instead do this. And he gives the ethical and moral responsibilities of being a Christian. Don't steal. Instead, help your neighbor with their property. Don't gossip. Instead, but speak well of your neighbor. And on and on and on these go. This is one of the first foundations for a Christian life. If you just know number 1, you're in good shape. But I'd invite you to read all 10 this week. And also, I would invite you to pray through these. Pray through the small catechism. I think the small catechism, especially the first commandment, is foundational for prayer. It demands an undivided heart. That is, a heart that clings to God alone. You shall have no other gods. And then you have 9 more commandments. And what are they doing? They are helping us to understand we need some rules, we need some boundaries, we need a foundation in our life. Because what does Jesus say? If you build your life on sand, you're going to have nothing at the end of the day. But if you build your life on rock, on God's word, on prayer, worship, commitment to serve someone more than yourself. That's the rock you need. And when you do that, your life really means something special. Built on the rock. That's our theme this month, foundations. And the rock is not the rules. The rock is who? The rock is Jesus, right? We build on Jesus. And we look at the small catechism, and that helps us focus on some foundational aspects of our faith. And those foundational things are all about Jesus, built on the rock. And so we build on the rock, who is Jesus. We need strong foundations. If we don't have strong foundations, at some point the storm will come. And you all know what I'm talking about. The storms come in life. And when the storms come, if you're not built on rock, things get washed away because it feels like a disaster and you don't know what to do. And so we want to build on the rock. The rock is Jesus. Our series is Foundations. And if we can build on Jesus, if we build on that rock, even when the tests come, even when the trials come, even when the temptations come, we are going to stand firm. Amen.